I was shocked when I said I wanted a divorce, but he was prepared and had a brutal revenge plan. I thought I would be saving myself and throwing my husband under the bus by asking for a divorce, but he ended up being one step ahead of me and backstabbed me without thinking twice. Hi, my name is Angela, and I have been married for 3 years now. I am into making food for various events, and I have been doing it for a while now. I am 28 years old. The name of my husband is Phil. Phil is 30 years old, and he is into real estate services. Phil and I met through a mutual friend. Our friend at that time said that she liked the kind of life I was living, and she wanted me to at least get to meet her friend Phil. I didn't want to think too much into it at that time, and so I brushed it off because I had just left a relationship and I didn't want to go into another one. But somehow our mutual friend convinced me, and I told her that she could give my number out to him. I met Phil for the first time, and I was not impressed because he tried a lot to impress me, and I wasn't really buying into it, and so I ignored him. So our first meeting was a little awkward. I didn't really understand who Phil was at first, but as time went on, we began to understand and relate with each other. We dated for a while and everything got heated up within us. Our relationship was moving in the right direction. I was so happy because I told myself that there was a time that I wanted nothing to do with him. But I thanked God that I was able to come out of my shell and let Phil love me. Phil was a person that had no problem at all. He was treating me right, and of course he had his flaws, which I ignored. One of his flaws was the fact that he could go mute on certain things, and he could just keep it to himself. I didn't like that I didn't want to have that in my life. I wanted someone who could communicate with me regardless. But I ignored that red flag, and we continued dating. We dated for a while. There were days that it was all fun, and there were days that we had issues. In all, I was in love with Phil, and I was ready to take chances with him. The fact that I ignored those red flags was the beginning of all my problems. I told my family about Phil. My family as in my mother. My mother was my everything. She had been supporting me for as long as I can remember. She supported my dreams, so when I told her about Phil, she was so happy and she supported me all the way. When she met him, she was happy, and a few weeks later, Phil asked me to marry him, and I was skeptical about it for a while. I felt like we hadn't known each other for that long, and he was talking about marriage. I took time to myself to think about the whole thing, and I was happy that Phil understood where I was coming from, and he gave me space to think about it. I was grateful for everything. I told my friend Patricia, and she advised me to go with my guts and do what made me happy. After some weeks, I could see that me holding back my answers was taking a toll on Phil. I accepted his proposal, and we got engaged. We planned our wedding, and it was everything and more. I got to meet Phil's family, and they literally welcomed me into their home. After the wedding, we planned to spend time in our new home. Phil had told me to move in with him, and I wasn't comfortable with that, and so I told him that it was okay for us to just buy a house together. He agreed, and we did. It was a lot at first because I had to move things around and put things in order. It was a lot, and I was helped by Phil. He made sure that I stressed less, and I was grateful. So a few months after we were settled, we went back to our respective fields. My business was going well, and I was grateful. Every morning, Phil and I had our routine, and we were very comfortable with it. My work can be very stressful, but I still had to make time for my husband and my home. Married life can be really demanding. Phil was the type that he wanted everything to be traditional. I made food, did laundry, and so on. At first, I was okay with it, as it became too much for me when Phil was always feeling reluctant to do basic things for himself, like picking up his plates after eating or ironing his clothes. I was not able to juggle everything together, and the day I told him about how tired I was, I called me lazy. It was a huge fight that day, but I tried my best to avoid the temptation of quarreling. It was our first fight as a married couple. It was bad, but we found our way back to each other. We made sure that we resolved everything. He apologized to me, and I forgave him. He did everything right by apologizing, and I decided to forget everything. As time went on, we made plans to communicate more and do the needful. Days passed, and he made a great effort to apologize. Weeks later, we made plans to go see my mother and spend a few days with her. I had to literally drag Phil with me to go see her. My mother was really fond of Phil, so they went along just fine. During the visit to the town that I grew up in, I got the biggest shock of my life. My high school crush Matthew was also in town. I got to know that he came back from the military and he was finally down. That was the exact reason why we broke up in the first place. He wanted to go into the military, and I told him that I couldn't wait, and so we broke up. It had to be the most painful thing to happen to me in my life because I loved him, and I didn't want to lose him, but I couldn't stop him from living, and so we had to break up. When I heard that he was in town, I didn't know how to feel because it brought back a lot of memories that I had locked away. I told my mother that we had to leave after a few days because I didn't want to see Matthew, and most importantly, I didn't want him and Phil to run into each other, but that didn't happen because we did see each other and we just said hello. But Matthew wanted to talk to me, which I brushed off because I was with Phil. I had to beg Matthew that I was going to see him later if he didn't cause a scene in the presence of my husband. He agreed, and he left. I was happy that Phil didn't see us, or else he could be suspicious. Of course, after that day I tried to see Matthew, but there was no chance for me, and so I created time one day that Phil went out with my mother. I met up with Matthew, and he started talking about how he had missed aita and how he wanted to have me back in his life. I had to tell him that it was not going to be possible since I was married, but he explained to me that he knew that I still had feelings for him, and we should explore it and see where it will go. I knew in my heart that I hadn't really forgotten about my first love, which was Matthew, but there was nothing I could do now. I was married, and I loved my husband. I told him that he should just leave me alone, and I left. But he didn't listen to me. Matthew was very persistent. He could show up at random places, and I used to pray that Phil didn't see us because he could be angry. Matthew somehow got my phone number after we left town, and he started to disturb me. It was not that I wasn't still in love with him, it's just that I didn't want to leave my husband and start all over with someone I wasn't sure he was going to stay with. Matthew left me once. What was the guarantee that he wasn't going to leave again when things got rough? After we got back, I went straight to my work because I had a lot of events planned and Phil had different business to attend to, so he was out of town. After work, I could go get drinks with Patricia. I think she was more fun than me. She had everything going on for her. She was single and just living her life. I told her about the problem I was in with Matthew, and she advised me to just have a seat down with him and iron things out in order for the both of us to be able to move on from everything. I kind of saw where she was coming from, and I agreed. She also advised me to be very careful in order not to jeopardize my marriage to Phil. I spoke to Matthew about the whole thing, and he said he was only going to have a conversation with me if I came to his hotel room. I didn't think too much into it, and so I went to his hotel room because I just wanted everything to be done with and for me to move on with my life. And that also entails burning the feelings I had for him. I was done. I needed to concentrate on my marriage. I got to the hotel room and we started talking. We talked for a while and Matthew and I kissed. It wasn't planned. I started to leave when things got heated up between us. We eventually had sex, and I had missed feelings at first because I had just cheated on my husband, and I hoped he didn't find out. What I did went against everything I stood for. In my mind, I had just committed a great sin. But Matthew told me that I shouldn't beat myself up because of something I had no control over. He was able to brainwash me to think that I hadn't done anything wrong. After that day, Matthew and I kept him in touch. We could talk every day when I am at work. I made it so that Phil will not see me talking on the phone. But after that day, everything began to change between me and Phil. He became distant. He barely talked to me. It was as if he had found out that I cheated on him. I asked him what the matter was, and he told me that it was nothing, and he was just under the weather. I brushed it off and went on with my life. I kept going out with Matthew, and I was also having sex with him, which I was not proud of, but there was nothing I could do. I made sure that we kept our relationship from the public eye so that people would not see us. My relationship with Phil felt so new and fresh, it was as if we hadn't separated in the first place. Everything was moving smoothly. I didn't know what was wrong with Phil at some point, because he became harsh and angry with me all the time. I knew that there was no way for him to know that I had been cheating, so I was confused that he was so distant from me. I had told my friend Patricia about Phil's latest attitude towards me, and she advised me that we should try and see a therapist. I left out the part where I cheated on my husband because I didn't want to be judged. And I also knew that she could drag me for cheating, but there was nothing I could do. I don't even know if it was love that I still had for Matthew, or if it was just infatuation, but there was something there. Since what Phil was going through was bigger than me, apparently, I told him that maybe it was wise for us to see a therapist. He refused, and he assured me that everything was okay between us. He told me that he was just going through a tough time at work, and there was nothing to worry about. My affair with Matthew went on for months, and I still believed that nobody saw us together. But everything began to change for the worst when Matthew started to disappear on me. We could stay for weeks without seeing each other, and I was missing him. The attention I gave to Matthew, I didn't give it to my own husband, and so his Matthew absence for a while was affecting me. I even stopped caring for Phil at a time, because then I hardly see him at home. He was always busy. It was unlike him. and I became worried. Phil and I were living in the same house, but we were far apart, and Matthew was ignoring me. It was as if I had no one again. So I decided to find out the reason why Matthew had been ignoring me. It was then that I got the biggest shock of my life. Matthew had told me that everything we had was fun, but he didn't think that he wanted to move on with me. I told him that I don't want to move on with him either, that I was married. I was only interested in having fun and getting the attention that he was giving me, which I wasn't receiving from my husband. He told me that I was a cheat, that he didn't want to have me in his life, that people like me who could confidently cheat on their husbands could do a lot worse. I became confused because what had caused this kind of mood shift in Matthew. I thought he loved me, and I thought he was going to fight for me, but I was wrong. He just used me for my body and nothing else. I was so angry, and there were days I cried myself to sleep. I thought that Matthew could not break my heart for the second time, but he did. He insulted me and degraded me without any form of remorse. I wished I never met someone as bad as Matthew. But I told myself that I wasn't going to let that bring me down. I made sure to move on with my life and at least try and work on my marriage in order to take my mind off a lot of things. Me thinking too much then was taking a toll on me. I told myself I needed something that would distract me, and I got the idea from my mother when she called and told me that she was still accepting grandchildren, and it clicked to me that Phil and I hadn't really talked about having children, and so I told myself that we were going to discuss it. But when I finally got hold of Phil, he told me that he wasn't ready to have children with me, and he didn't give me a valid reason. He walked out on me and he brushed the conversation aside, but I knew that I wasn't done. After that day, Phil began to avoid me. He no longer ate his food. He hardly came home. It was as if I was living alone without a husband, but I wanted children from Phil, and I don't know why he didn't want children. We are married and we love each other. Why was he avoiding this topic? I explained my plight to my friend Patricia, and she told me to approach it calmly, but there was nothing to be calm about. We had the finances, and so what was holding my husband back? I knew that something was really wrong because Phil had changed. He was so distant from me. When we first got married, we were also so lovely, but now he was another thing. I kept asking myself, where did I go wrong? There was no possible way for him to know that I had cheated. He was not always around, and most times that Matthew and I went out, we were always so careful. I told myself that I was going to ask him what the problem was, but I knew that I was going to do it with a lot of sense. But my patience was going thin. When I spoke to Phil again, things really got heated up between us. We exchanged words that we were both not proud of. I told him that I was tired of being treated as furniture in my husband's house, and I told him that I want a divorce, and he told me that it was fine, and he left the house. The very next day I received paper, and it was my husband divorcing me. I told myself that it was an expensive joke because the problem we had wasn't that serious for him to give me divorce papers. What did I do? Just like that. We had a little quarrel, and I wasn't expecting to be divorced the next day. We are married. Married couples always have issues. What is happening? Where did I go wrong? I even tried to get through to Phil, but it was possible it was as if he disappeared. I told my mother and Patricia what I was going through, and they came to comfort me. I knew that there had to be more to all that happened because I didn't do anything bad. Maybe Phil already had a woman he wanted to marry, and he wanted to discard me, but I made sure that I was not going to allow him to be happy in that relationship. How was he going to be enjoying his life and leave me hanging? I told myself that I was going to drag this divorce. He had no right to divorce me on baseless issues. We were asked to report to court, and I did. In all the processings, I made sure to talk about how baseless the divorce was, that the court was just wasting their time. But when Phil was asked what was the reason for the divorce, he said it was because I cheated on him. I was so shocked how it was possible for him to know that I cheated on him. There was no possible way. I was careful. I left the court that day, and the news had spread all over that I had cheated on my husband. My mother called me to tell me how disappointed she was in me. But I knew that Phil had no proof that he cheated on him, and I was going to prove that tomorrow that I didn't cheat, and he was just claiming what he wasn't sure of. My mother was making things difficult for me by blaming me and telling me that I should have done better, but I told her that I didn't cheat on my husband, but she didn't believe me at all. So I told myself that I will just avoid her so I can be sane. I assured myself that there was no way that anybody could know that I cheated. The next day in court, Phil was able to prove that I had cheated on him with pictures of me and Matthew together. I was so shocked how he got the pictures, it was all new to me. I thought I was very careful about what happened, how it happened. I was disgraced in court that day. I was looked down upon as the woman who cheated on her husband, and the fact that they were pictures to back it off. I wished I wasn't disgraced like that. I wished my husband didn't take this cruel revenge of taking pictures of me with Matthew. I was so ashamed of myself. After what had transpired in court, I advised myself that all this wasn't worth it. I should just divorce Phil and let everything go. I was tired. And the fact that Phil still went ahead to release the pictures to my family in order for him to prove a point killed me so much.
And that
I thought there was love between us before we got married. I don't know why Phil could do this to me. People in the community started to avoid me. Some people called me all different types of names. My friends stopped picking my calls. I was just all alone in the house. I was asked to pay some amount of money to Phil, and I did. Even if it was with me paying through my nose, I still paid. Everything I ever held dearly was taken from me. I tried my best to try and sit down with Phil in order to explain things to him, why, and cheated. And all but he ignored me. I begged him to listen to me, but Phil was hell-bent on making my life miserable. A few weeks later, the house, where we built our home, was forcefully taken away from me, and I didn't know how I was going to survive. I couldn't go and stay with my mother because she made it clear that she wants nothing to do with me since I disagreed with her. But I was bent on making things right. When I went to my mother's house and I saw Phil there, I was happy because I knew that it was an opportunity for me to apologize to him and maybe beg him to take me back. But I received the shock of my life when my mother asked me to leave because she wasn't ready to see my face. But I didn't have anywhere to go. I was being rejected from entering my own home, and my own mother didn't want to have anything to do with me. Phil had turned the whole thing against me. How he managed to do it, I don't know. I was able to pack my things to a small hotel, and I stayed there. There were days I cried my eyes out, and there were days that I had nothing to do but to just sit and regret making the wrong decision. Update. Right now, I am just trying to put my life in order. I was able to see a small job that I have been managing for a while now. I regret my decisions. I wished I never saw Matthew to begin with. He came and he scattered my life. He scattered my marriage. Phil was a wonderful man, and I used his gentleness to my own gain, and at last I got burned. My mother was coming around a little, but at least it was a step in the right direction. I told myself that I needed to make the right choices, and I was going to apologize to and forgive myself for doing everything I did.